We got a phone call at the beginning of the week, this last week, and that put us in a situation where I had to fly to Mexico City on Wednesday afternoon. And it was just a quick trip that I came back the next day. But going to Mexico City, although in my mind it was so sudden and I was on a mission, I knew where I was going. We had a death in the family and I have to be at the funeral site. Once I got there that Wednesday night, and especially Thursday throughout the day, it just dawned on me. It just kind of just hit me. It's been 27 years since I have been in Mexico City. I had the privilege to go to school in Mexico City. Part of my seminary training, it was in Mexico City. So we spent 3 summers total there. And so when I was there, I was like, whoa, I've kind of forgotten, 27 years. My last trip was in 1990. So that was a long time ago. And the other thing that just kind of reminded me, because many of you know this, but I was 12 years old, September 19th, 1985. September 19th, 1985. Massive earthquake that shook the city of Mexico. It was horrendous. It was a bad deal. And I still remember. I was 12. We drove through downtown. We drove through some of these sites. And again, in my mind, I'm going back to those experiences. And here's what I was reminded. And this is why we need to talk about John chapter 14 today. There are several buildings that they are still standing in Mexico City after this massive earthquake. Many buildings are long gone, and thousands of people die on that earthquake. And part of the reason why these buildings are standing in a city that is constantly moving. I don't know if you know anything about this city, Mexico City, but it's constantly moving. So earthquakes in Mexico City happen all the time, but they're so small that people don't feel them. You don't feel those, but apparently it's constantly moving. And there is this beautiful building downtown that back then, and it still is, it continues to sink. It's sinking, it literally sinking. So when you look at pictures and you Google these pictures and you stand there, you see the building going sideways, and there is really nothing they can do. Now, the other buildings that again, they remain standing, specifically one, I still remember this building. Part of the reason why it's still standing after the 1985 earthquake is because apparently when they built this building, the building has of height from the ground all the way to the top is exactly what the building has of foundation going down. So when you see this massive building, you have to picture in your mind that the height of the building is exactly the length of the foundation that is built underground. So last week, when we came and celebrated the resurrection of Jesus, I want you to think that the resurrection of Jesus is that foundation of our faith. Without the foundation, earthquakes, waves will move us and eventually destroy us. The reason why we stand here after 2,000 years as a church, as the church of Jesus, is because the foundation of the resurrection from the dead is unmovable. Christ is alive, and we confess, we believe, we embrace this reality. And that's what we are able to move and build. So for the last few weeks, I've been asking you to think about not simply the goal, or not make the mistake to invert or to swap things around, where we make what is supposed to be the foundation, we make it the goal. So please listen to me for a moment, because this is where we're going for the next few minutes. So this foundation, which is the resurrection of Jesus, is important that you and I, we embrace it. But that's not the goal. See, the goal is for us to make decisions in life that reflect that Jesus is alive. What does that mean? That implies that for many Christians, for many people in this country, around the world, we make the resurrection of Jesus a theological, doctrinal, and even, last week or the week before, there was the brand new movie that came out, not the topic, because it was a book before it became a movie, but now it's called The Case of Christ by Lee Strobel. It's in movie theaters, which I'm all for that. So we make the resurrection of Jesus sometimes even to the point of bringing it into apologetics or the defending of the faith. I'm all for those things, but I want you to hear me say this again. The resurrection of Jesus has and must transform and change how we make decisions. So we not only embrace this as a reality, as the cornerstone of who we are, but the question is, what does that mean on a Monday afternoon, on a Tuesday morning, on a Thursday in the middle of the night, that suddenly whatever is concerning you wakes you up, and now you're thinking about whatever that means. So how do we do that? See, because last week, if you were with us, and I don't know how many of you were with us, we went through this passage in John, but now we went to chapter 12, and basically, describing the resurrection, I invite you to think about in these terms, because we describe this resurrection in the concept of how Paul described it in Corinthians. He says, if Jesus is not alive, then your faith is literally like my currency from Belarus. It's still money, it's just not helpful. Remember that? If Jesus is not alive, then your faith is like counterfeit money. It's not authentic faith. And then I told you at the end, I gave you 3 examples. The last one was, if Jesus is not alive, your faith is like monopoly money. Remember that? Funny money. So I gave you those 3 scenarios because if Jesus is not alive, then everything is futile. Everything is in vain. What I want us to do today is to move now into what that means. Since Jesus is alive, now the question is, what does that mean? And here's what I want you to think for a moment. And this is not on your handouts, so you're going to have to kind of follow me with this. But the faith in Jesus, which is believing that he is alive, believing that he came back from the dead, provides the way to heaven for me, for you. Without the resurrection, there is no access to heaven. But now, when you embrace the faith of Jesus, not simply the faith in Jesus, but now you and I, we're practicing the faith that pleases the Lord. Now that allows for heaven to have its way in me. So what I'm asking you to do is, heaven, I'm sorry, but heaven I don't think is necessarily the goal. And I want you to go to heaven, and I want you to be certain that you will go to heaven. But if you are breathing, if you are here, and if the game is not over, so to speak, you have to make sure, I have to make sure, that when it comes to our faith, it's not like the currency from Belarus, it's not counterfeit, and obviously you don't want a faith that is funny faith, like monopoly faith. So how do we do that? Well, I want you to see that the faith in Jesus is not the goal. That's just the beginning. There is no salvation unless you put your trust in Jesus. But the question comes, once you do that, what happens? Once you do that, true faith in Jesus develops the faith of Jesus in me. So Jesus continued the conversation in John chapter 14. It's that conversation with the disciples. I told you from day one, this is the scenario of the upper room experience. Few days from being crucified, from being tortured, from being executed, and eventually put on a graveside. He's having this conversation where he's celebrating the Passover. And we're going to do that today, right? But he's celebrating this with them. And now it's time for the testing, that the disciples are not just hoping that he is Messiah so he can bring heaven, which in this case for the disciples is the restoration of Jerusalem, is the removal of the Roman government. They want things to be better, which is a legit concern. But now Jesus is going to test them in the next few verses, where now the disciples are going to need to learn how to react to circumstances that may be unmovable, unshakable, maybe irreversible, circumstances that could not be avoided. And the issue now is, how do we respond to life in a manner that reflects and parallels the way Jesus responded when he faced those things? Because you and I know, I mean, you know the story. They're in the upper room. They move into the garden to pray. The Roman soldiers show up, take him prisoner. And from that moment on, it's going to be pretty much hell on earth for this band of brothers. It's not going to get any better. It's not going to get any more comfortable. It's going to be tested to the limit. And that testing has to do with them, us, embracing the views, the reactions, the mindset, the thinking, the speech, the feelings of Jesus Christ. Instead of just simply saying, well, I believe in Jesus. When I face a trial, a tribulation, I pray to Jesus, and I believe Jesus can break through. Yes, he can. But what if I told you that the breakthrough of Jesus is through you, is through me, is through us? So what does that mean? Well, here's how he does that. On verses 15 through 17, he basically says the following. Verse 15, he says, if, or since, you love me. If, or since, meaning loving means that you have put your trust in me. If you are a follower of Jesus, you love Jesus. Right? But now, since you love me, guess what? Since you love me, you must... That's what you do. When you love me, you must understand that this love is reflected through action. And I love the scriptures because, see, here's the beauty of this. This is why the scriptures is not a magical formula. This is not just a quick fix. When John writes in chapter 14, if you love me, then keep my commands. The concept of love is a possibility. It's not assuming that everybody loves Jesus or loves God. Especially if you and I, we have been trained. If you and I, we were pre-programmed, if we were brought into a subculture of Christianity, and I'm fixing to offend some people, but just hang on. Just be merciful to me. Do not leave. Stay to the end of the movie, because I'm fixing to say a couple of things that I think are very important. We have been trained to take this statement and completely, by default, without knowing, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, we deleted the bottom part. Most of us, we came into a culture, or we were brought into a church culture that we simply said, if you just pray a prayer, be very honest, and have that feeling that you know because you know that Jesus is your Savior, and you invite Him into your heart, then you can live as you please. And when you die, you will go to heaven. That's not the biblical view. See, what I'm asking you to think about for a moment is that loving Jesus, loving God, begins by putting your trust in Him, but then for you to have the ability to obey His commands, you need the faith of Him. What you will never be able to do is to obey the commands of Jesus simply by saying, I am a Christian. Because here's what I know. I've walked through this for a while now. And I actually study the scriptures because it's my job, I guess. I don't know. I just have to do that. But here's what I will tell you. If you disregard the faith of Jesus and you settle for the faith in Jesus, the commands are still present, but then they will become a duty to you. Is anybody tracking what I mean by the word duty? Now they become an obligation versus a joy. So we have unspoken rules at home. Do you have unspoken rules in your house? I have unspoken rules. In other words, there are things that happen in my house automatically. We don't talk about them. They're just there. And one of those has to do with breakfast. I am the breakfast brother right here. This is where breakfast stops in my house. Now I have 3 young adults. So breakfast and lunch and dinners, but specifically breakfast, are a big meal in my house. It's a real meal. You know, we don't do the cereal thing, the cereal or just the toast. No, that's not breakfast. That's an abomination of breakfast. You have to do the real breakfast. So part of this breakfast thing is I'm the cook. So every morning I get up and I just cook breakfast. And I cook a full meal breakfast. There are 2 ways that I can cook breakfast. I can cook breakfast really upset because no one is up except me, because I'm the first one to get up. So out of the responsibility, the duty, well, I guess I have 3 kids. If I would have 3 parrots, I would have to get up in the morning and, maybe a little dog or whatever, but I chose to have kids. So now that I have kids, I have to cook breakfast. Somehow, in the concept of cooking breakfast for me, I have to make sure that when it comes to that commands or responsibilities, they don't become toxic and even to the point that now I can potentially use them in an argument with my wife eventually throughout the day and remind her that I'm the breakfast guy. That while you guys sleep, I'm cooking breakfast. By the time my wife and the kids get up, guess what? Breakfast is ready. So if I'm not careful, I can take those actions that they have to get done because they need to eat breakfast. We all need to eat breakfast. But in this case, how do you keep that sense of doing it out of your relationship to, in my case, to my wife and my kids? See, what I'm asking you to do today is to think for a moment how the Bible describes this concept. That love, the love that we have for God, is not a love that you and I somehow created or developed or pray for. The love that we have for God is the evidence that a foreign agent, please listen to the language, an outside agent, someone besides me, came into my life, created a regenerated experience where I was lost, now I am found, I was dead, now I'm alive. And when Jesus came and dwelt in my life, He gave me His love for the Father. So no human being has the ability to love God without Jesus. You and I, we will never love God on our own. You and I will never be able to simply say, oh, God is a much better choice than the choices that I've made in my life. So I think I'm going to go with God because that's the winning team. No, we don't have that ability. The Bible describes you and I as enemies of God. That our sin, listen to this, our sin was never accidental. If you are not a follower of Jesus and you do not love God, that implies that you have no choice. You sin out of duty. Because legally, you belong to someone else besides God. See, when this foreign agent comes into your life through a conversion, when this foreign agent by the name of Jesus comes and dwells in your heart, He not only makes you a friend of God, but He gives you a passion for God. So that implies that this passion is reflected in obedience. This is why Jesus is reminded the disciples that if you love me, or since you love me, guess what? You're going to have to obey my commands. For some reason, I have the impression that for some of us, this love and obedience, love and commands, sounds like a contradiction of terms. We live in a time and age that love seems to be like everybody needs to agree. Love means that everybody needs to get along. Love means that I'm here just to please her or to please them. That's not the case. That's not the case. In this case, love is the combination of reminding ourselves, so please listen to this. Reminding ourselves that what you and I may call unconditional love of God, right? That He loved us first. That when we were still sinners, He died for us. That unconditional love from God does not imply an unconditional relationship with God. Meaning that if you are a follower of Jesus, one of the beauties of salvation is that you and I are awakened, are open into our eyes to see the boundaries of what the Bible presents as the law of God. The boundaries that in the past, when I thought about commands, before I embraced the love of Jesus for the Father, I look at commands as controlling. This is why church was never appealing. This is why some of our kids and grandkids, they're not in church anymore. Because, see, they see commands as controlling. They see commands as something that is telling us what to do and how to live. Versus when you embrace God and you embrace the love of God, now you understand that the commands of God, they do not exist to control us. The commands of God, they exist to protect us. That's the reason. And that's why out of this love for love from God, and the evidence of my conversion is obedience. So I'm going to put it to you very simple. I got to move on. I have 2 more verses to go. Here's the bottom line. If you are in this place, and you or me are defiantly and with no hesitation disobeying God over issues or matters that we know that they're disobedience, that is a serious problem. Obedience is not perfection. Obedience is simply understanding and having the ability that when and as I potentially or maybe eventually or continually sin, I have the conviction in my heart that disobedience to God is a major problem. So many Christians, unfortunately, can potentially and would potentially go through life just willingly and defiantly disobeying and have no problem with that. Well, see, this is what Jesus focuses, that after I learn to obey, he says, and I will ask the Father, because obedience is crucial. I'm going to ask the Father, and the Father is going to give you, the word you is plural, all of you all, is going to give you another, what's the word? Advocate. Have you heard of this advocate word? Do you know what that means? So I'm going to say this again. I'm hoping that at this point you can see the passion of Jesus in the sense of obedience, because these Jewish boys in the upper room are going to be tested to the core about their obedience. And you know the story. All of them with no exception, especially the one that loved to talk, the most outspoken by the name of Peter, but every one of them will fail the test. They disobey. One of them is going to commit suicide, right? So everybody fails the test. But now, since the task is beyond my ability, your ability, in other words, your desire to obey comes from God, but your ability to obey also comes from God. Everybody okay on that? I'm going to say that again. Your desire to obey, your ability to see the difference between obedience and disobedience. You look at choices, you look at temptation, you look at situations in life, and in your mind, in your heart, you know what you're supposed to do. That ability, that shifting of worldview comes from God. But what you cannot do is divorce knowing what to do and having the ability to do. And I'll give you a perfect example. Forgiveness. Forgiveness is something that is pretty obvious. Everybody knows that we're supposed to forgive. Everybody knows that a broken relationship between a mom and a dad, or a mom and a daughter, or a grandkid and a grandfather, or whatever, is abnormal. Having the ability to do it, this is where you're gonna have to understand that this is you and that's me. You having a desire to obey. See, the task of obedience is like lifting those weights, and that's you trying to obey. And Jesus is saying, I'm going to have to ask the Father. You don't have to ask, because see, you don't have to ask, because you got to remember that these Jewish people, they have mastered the commands. They never thought, the Jewish people never thought that they needed help performing the commands. They were so arrogant that now they became the measurement of commandment fulfillment. Have you ever met individuals that they think that their spiritual gift is to tell you how wrong you are? Is anybody married to one? No, I'm just playing. But is everybody tracking? See, Jesus is asking them to think for a moment that the commands given by God, the law, the 10 Commandments, the law, please look at me for a second, was given not so the people of God can fulfill them and belong to God, so you can pass the test. The commands were given from day one as a result of the love that God had for the people that already, prior to the commandments, belonged to Him. Isn't that good news to you this morning? I'm going to say that again, because this is a huge parenting skill. How do I, without compromising the commands, because my kids still got to follow commands, how do I convey the commands not so they can think or believe or do life as is they have to prove themselves so they can be my child? They can be my children. But because you are my child, because I am your father, and because I love you so much, guess what? I got to give you the commands. So the disciples have forgotten that. So today what I'm asking you to do is to think that if you are going to be able to obey, If I'm going to be able to be, if I'm going to be found faithful in obedience, this is how I begin the conversation. You don't begin the conversation by saying, I can lift it up. I can do this. This is why you're a loser, because I'm able to do that. This is why you don't come to church. If you would just be like me and come to church, you wouldn't be going through these things. Is everybody tracking in here? You begin every single conversation. You begin every argument. You begin every experience in difficulties and in blessings by understanding that you and I are like this baby. We know I'm supposed to lift it up. I just don't know how to do it. This is why Jesus says, I'm going to give you another advocate to help you. And here's the beauty. It's going to help you to do what? Watch this, please. See, the goal is not to lift the weights, although it's important to lift or to obey. But you know what the goal is? Is that he will be with you. How long? So let me put it to you very, very simple. I love parenting. I love to parent my kids. But you know what I love the most about parenting? That I get to do it with Areli. I don't know if that makes any sense. In other words, I could be a single man and never marry and still parent because I can adopt kids. I can be a divorced man and still parent. I can be a widow and still parent. So parenting is important, and I love parenting. But the beauty about parenting is that I get to do it with her. Because in my case, parenting, as much as I love it, as much as I love my kids, as much as I love marriage, I'm about the girl. Right? It's about the girl. For me, it's about the girl. I love this girl. I want to be with this girl. So make sure that when it comes to this advocate, you don't see this promise of the Holy Spirit just as someone that is going to help you with the task, because you might be more consumed by the task than actually the helper that enables you to fulfill the task. Anybody on what I'm saying? Please make sure that your passion for obedience is simply because obedience unto God, the faith of Jesus, is not simply that moves me from calamities into healing, whether it's physically, emotional, or to have a better church. See, the beauty of obedience is that obedience is simply the journey that I get to walk with Him forever, implying that Jesus is reminding them, I will not be with you forever physically, but I'm going to send you an advocate, a foreign agent that will come and help you move forward. So on your handouts, I want you to see that what he's describing is literally the other Jesus, the Holy Spirit. So the Spirit is not simply a task-oriented individual. The Spirit of God is not simply the person that allows you to be obedient. It's literally the other Jesus. Now, this is important, and eventually is going to come into the lives of the disciples, and they're going to be reminded of this. But let me just ask you to think with me for a moment what is happening in this moment and in this time. When you write on your handouts the other Jesus, you got to remember this, that beyond the fact, beyond the ability for these Jewish boys, the disciples, to see Jesus as the fulfillment of the law and to see Him as Messiah, I'm going to say this. I believe they have learned to love this man. Historians will tell you that he is a distant cousin of John, the writer of this gospel. Eventually, there is a half-brother that comes to know the gospel. What I'm trying to tell you is that please do not miss the concept of intimacy in the upper room. That something is taking place in history for the lives of these men that implies the picture, the imagery of a table, because they're having supper together. And when you hear him say that he's sending another Jesus or the other Jesus, is the concept that this moment in human history between you, Jesus, with the disciples of intimacy must continue. See, this is why John finishes by saying this, This other Jesus, what is his name? It's the Spirit of truth. Now, please, I don't have time to go into details, but I want you to process the words of John by reversing these statements. If there is a spirit of truth, that implies that there was or there is a spirit of, what's the opposite? What's the opposite of truth? There's a spirit of lie. Are you aware of that? Do you understand what's happening here? That in this world, this obedience, this love, this passion, this helper that we need implies that if you try to do this on your own, that maybe this is the morning that for the first time you understand that you're trying to be a better husband, a better wife, a better citizen, a better father, whatever you're trying to do. Look at me for a second. See, it begins by understanding that Jesus doesn't simply improve your condition. Jesus takes you from lies, from death, from lostness into a brand new experience. I'm afraid that many of us, we spend time in community with God through church and ministry and practices like the Lord's Supper, but we approach the table with such arrogance that we do not recognize that inside of me, what it is always at work is a spirit of divisiveness. That I'm not simply kind of a refurbished individual. I'm not simply a new person that I used to be in the past. I used to be different. No, I was lost. I used to be a follower of lies. I used to be the individual that I thought I can do everything on my own. And that every one of you serve as my commodity. And relationships many times became a stepping stone into a better me. See, that is the spirit of lies. And Jesus is looking at this man. And they're going to have to make some serious decisions about truth and about falsehood. And they're going to have to embrace this reality by saying this: the world, without putting your faith in Jesus, you will never be able to experience the faith of Jesus. So the world has no ability, even if they want to, even if they pray, even if they try, even if they want to really experience a new life, you cannot do this. This is what he says. The reason is because this world, what happens to them? They do not see. They don't see. They don't see what's going on. So translate this into the concept of lostness. We went to Mexico City. Used to be the biggest city in the world. It's a massive, massive city. The graveside, the cemetery that we bury the uncle in is a cemetery you can only imagine. It's a mountain. And it has multiple layers, literally just layers and layers of the cemetery. And last year, there was another family member that was buried on that site. And you literally need to have directions. You have to figure out where the individual was buried. We probably looked for the site, and this is just last May of last year. We looked for the site for an hour and a half. We couldn't find her. We don't know where she was buried. We're like, where is she? I don't know. I think it's here. No, it's here. So here's the point. When you're lost, typically, when you're lost, when you're not able to see, you typically don't know that you're lost until you realize that you're lost. But by the time you realize you're lost, then you've been lost for a while. You just didn't see it. So what Jesus is describing is that now this world doesn't see him, and this world neither knows him. Knows him. So this morning I want you to think about the ability that you have to know God. And I'm going to say it again. The concept of this experience of the table and sitting or coming around this table, and the concept of knowing him, of intimacy. Jesus says, you know him. And since you know him, you need to understand that you know him because he lives now with you. And he is going to be with you forever. this morning I want to invite you to embrace the reality that you must know Jesus, but also the reality that you knowing him implies that he lives with you. And if he lives with you, he is going to be with you. And he's going to walk with you, and he's going to allow you to move into intimate moments, such a table with fellowshipping. And this table and this intimacy is an intimacy that you don't get to choose what side of the intimacy of the relationship. This is the moment where you understand that from this table, Jesus speaks to the disciples and says, in the past, you've celebrated this same event of the Passover. And in the past, you have seen the brokenness of a little sacrificial animal. And you have seen the shedding of the blood of this animal. But for the first time in human history, it's not an animal, it's not a priest that is doing the sacrifice, it is the Son of God. And for the first time, you're not seeing someone else's blood being shed, but in this case, it's my blood. So I'm going to invite our deacons to come and join me this morning as we celebrate this intimacy with God, as we think about the goodness of God on how we know him and how he gets to live with each and every one of us today.